Financing firm growth. Why are you writing this book? One idea here is that with a global uncertainty, also with a high level of public debt, private capital is more important than ever for the growth in emerging market countries and developing economies. So this brings us to the question that we want to address in this book. What is the role of capital markets in the growth of firms, jobs, and aggregate productivity in low and middle income countries? So the book will address this question in three parts. First, we will document the large expansion of capital market financing by firms around the world since 1990. And then we will document how the capital market expansion is driving investment, driving firm growth, as well as employment. And we will finish by documenting the key role that policy reform play in this expansion of capital markets. So the book, to address this, will use a novel database of issuance since 1990. In particular, we have 80,000 firms in 147 countries. And we will focus on the 20,000 firms located in 106 low and middle income countries. And here we will exclude China. China is in the book, but because of the size, we present it separately. So the data we use come from LSEG. LSEG is a London Stock Exchange Group. With debt and equity issuance, we come from Securities Data Company Platinum. And for the firm balance sheet, we will also have roll scope that will give the size of the firms. For the country income group, we will use the 1990 World Bank income group classification. And we start in 1990 because of our time period started in 1990. Now, the measure of expansion that we have, it is for the market activity is going to be cumulative net capital issuance, which is basically the sum of equity issuance and bond issuance since the beginning of the period here, since 1990, minus the bond as mature. So what do we find? What we find is that capital market financing for firms in low and middle income countries has grown significantly. In fact, by 2022, it has grown by 4 trillion. And the majority of this growth come after 2000. If you look at in middle income countries, the increase is about 4 times, and in low income countries is 8 times since 2000. Another interesting thing that also we have is that financing equity has been more prominent in low and middle income countries than using bond compared to high income countries. The size of the capital markets in low income countries is still smaller, but it's growing faster. So that's one element to get from this slide. One thing here is that this expansion of the capital market we just discussed has been associated with an increasing number of new issues in low and middle income countries. In fact, between 2000 and 2002, 14,000 firms became new participants in capital markets in low and middle income countries. Now, there's more firms, but also we're going to show here that more firms in more countries having access to capital market. For that, we look at 2 sub-periods. Let's look at 2000 and 2009. We see here 25 countries now come to capital markets. And we can see that from more or less all the regions here. Those countries do not have access to capital market in the 90s. But from 2000 to 2009, firms in those countries can have access to capital markets. One period for 2010, you see 20 more. And again, that's the orange, you see more firms coming in. So the conclusion here is that more firms in more countries having access to capital markets. Now, one interesting result that we found in this book is that most of this expansion is really coming from domestic capital markets rather than foreign capital markets. Domestic capital market basically in local currency. So we see here is that over time, the share of domestic issuance has been increasing. In fact, between 2010 to 22, it accounts more than 70% of the total issuance. The new issuers are also accounting for an increasing share of capital market financing in low and middle income countries. About more than 60% of the total issuance is accounted by 2022 by these new issuers. When you compare that to high income countries, it's only about 40%.
Tar has mentioned the expansion of capital markets in low and middle income countries. Now let me look at tell you the link that we find between this expansion of capital markets and growth on those countries. So the answer to this question is not obvious because capital markets can be used, first using capital markets can be linked to growth in the sense that firms using those proceeds, they can invest and expand, but also firms can use capital markets to repay expensive loans that they have from, let's say, banks, change the leverage ratios, increase the cash holdings, etc. So firms can use capital market financing for what we call non-productive uses. And ex ante, we don't know how firms are using them. So what we do in the book, we link this capital market issuance activity with the performance of firms over time. So we look at each time firms are issuing, how they are reacting. So these are estimations that we do with local projections, a new econometric technique, and we project how firms' growth, the expansion in physical capital, reacts when firms are issuing. And what we observe is that firms in low and middle income countries, relative to a control group of firms that are not issuing in capital markets, firms are expanding. So we see an expansion in capital markets of 16%, for example, in low-income countries at the time of issuance. So that suggests, I mean, it's not full evidence, but we have other type of evidence as well, but this suggests that firms are relaxing some type of financial constraints, firms have growth opportunities, and those growth opportunities are realized as they raise capital in capital markets. We also observe that new participants, the firms that are coming to the market for the first time, are expanding more relative to firms that are more established. So that suggests that capital markets are relaxing some type of financial constraints for these new participants. So this type of evidence, and these are just examples that are in the book, show that there is a link between this capital market issuance activity and the real side of the firms. And this is at the micro level, firm by firm. So what we do is we then try to aggregate this for all firms in a country, in a given industry, across industries, then across industries, and then across countries for a region. And then we have the aggregate effect of this capital market activity for different regions of the world. And what we do, we try to disentangle how much of the growth in physical capital, in employment, sales, etc., and in productivity are coming from this capital market activity and how relative to the growth that would happen without the capital market activity. And for productivity, what we look, where we divide firms that are very productive versus firms that are not productive, and we see that the ones that are issuing are the firms that are very productive relative to the same firms in the same country, in the same industry. And therefore, we see that firms that are issuing are the more productive ones, and that have an effect on productivity because otherwise would be unproductive firms that are investing. When we look at the aggregate effects, we see that there is an expansion in productivity, employment, and physical capital. And for example, for low-income countries, we estimate that 12% of the increase in productivity can be associated with the issuance in capital markets. It's 12% of employment and 21% of physical capital. So on the aggregate, even though there are relatively few firms that are issuing, those firms have an aggregate significant effect. And of course, this is for firms that are publicly listed for which we can obtain the work scope data.